Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bright Side of Life by Emile Zola, translated by Andrew Rothwell, narrated by Elizabeth Jasicki. Introduction. Listeners who are unfamiliar with the plot may prefer to consider the introduction as an afterword. When The Bright Side of Life, La Joie de Vivre, came out in book form in mid-February 1884, after serialization in the popular daily Le Gil Blas over the preceding 3 months, Emile Zola was 44 years old. On the face of it, he was already a literary success in France. The notoriety of L'Assommoir, 1877, a story of poverty and alcoholism in working-class Paris, had brought him significant wealth, with which he had bought his country residence on the banks of the Seine at Meudon. He was the acknowledged leader of the group of naturalist writers, including younger disciples Guy de Maupassant, Joris Karl Huysmans, and Henri Seyard, which met there in the course of his famous soirées. Since L'Assommoir, he had produced with apparent regularity 4 more novels in his Rougon Macquart saga about a family in Second Empire France, a love story, Une page d'amour, 1878, on the amorous moors of the petite bourgeoisie, Nana, 1880, the scandalous story of a high-class prostitute, Potluck, Pourboire, 1882, set in a modern apartment building, and The Lady's Paradise, Au Bonheur des Dames, 1883, about department store retailing. Yet The Bright Side of Life, which would turn out to be the 12th of the planned 20 Rougon Macquart volumes, had been delayed. Zola had begun work on it in 1880, buoyed by his recent completion of Nana. But from the start he had struggled to establish the novel's plot and setting. A succession of blows in his private life, including marital difficulties and the death of his beloved mother, Émilie, then led to a midlife crisis, culminating in a mental breakdown in October 1882, which left him unable to go on with what he had planned would be an uncharacteristically private book. So he turned his attention instead to Potluck, then The Lady's Paradise. It was not until he had completed the latter novel, on the 25th of January 1883, that he felt able to return to La Joie de Vivre, making its genesis, in the words of Henri Mitterrand, editor of the definitive edition of the Rougon Macquart cycle, more tormented, in the end, than that of any of the previous novels. The Bright Side of Life is something of a neglected masterpiece, with a reputation in France for being one of the finest love stories of the 19th century, but not really fitting in with the large-scale canvas of the other Rougon Macquart books. It sold only slowly, though it was critically well received. Mitterrand stresses its significance for our understanding of Zola himself. Far from being a minor novel, The Bright Side of Life stands out as the work most deeply anchored in Zola's temperament and his private life. Unlike the rest of the cycle, the novel is set neither in the Paris region nor in Plassans, Aix-en-Provence, the family's fictional place of origin, but on the Normandy coast, and Pauline, the young orphaned heroine, is the only substantive connection with the family line. Born in 1852, she is the daughter of Parisian charcutiers, pork butchers, Lisa Macquart and Quenu, central characters in The Belly of Paris, 1873. When the story begins, in 1863, Pauline's parents have died, and she is taken to live with relatives on her father's side, her aunt and uncle Chanteau. Madame Chanteau is a daughter of the de la Vinière family, minor nobility fallen on hard times, and her cousin Lazare in the fictional seaside village of Bonneville. In an interview in April 1880 with the journalist Fernand Zola described his planned future work, as yet without a title, as an intimate novel with few characters, written with great simplicity of style, a reaction against my previous works. A note in one of the preliminary sketches confirms that after Nana, he wanted to compose something on a more domestic scale. This is the novel I want to write. Good, honest people, placed in a drama that will develop the ideas of goodness and pain. Then it will all be down to how it is written. Not my usual symphony. A simple, straightforward story. Environment still playing its necessary role, but less to the fore. Descriptions reduced to a minimum. The style direct, correct, forceful, without romantic flourishes. The kind of classical language I dream of writing. In a word, honesty in everything, nothing dressed up. While he largely keeps to these early prescriptions, we may already note that description, particularly of the sea and its various moods, plays a much more vital role in the bright side of life than he originally planned. The early dichotomy of goodness and pain was certainly destined to remain the thematic axis on which the book turned. At times, the emphasis would seem to shift towards pain. For this to be a great book, the idea of pain would need to be dominant. But then a renewed assertion of the role of goodness would come in to compensate. The book must be bathed in affection. I want it to be a page from life, but a life that is simple and good, smiling. Since the Belly of Paris, Zola had set about the composition of all his novels in the same manner, starting by writing an extensive preparatory dossier, divided into 4 main parts: an outline sketch, ébauche, of the setting, plot, and main characters, then a section on characters, containing a detailed portrait of each, including, in The Bright Side of Life, the dog, Mathieu, based on Zola's own dog, Bertrand, and the cat, Minouche, with their main biographical, physical, and psychological attributes. Next, a section called Plans, containing a first plan in which narrative and descriptive elements were provisionally allocated to chapters, then a definitive plan for each, often completed only shortly before the actual writing of the chapter, and finally a notes section, containing the fieldwork jottings and other documentation he had gathered to ensure the accuracy and realism of the background information. Chantal Pierre Niarcionu comments that this highly rational approach, of which Zola made no secret, was intended as an exemplary illustration of the naturalist method. The planning notes, preparatory dossier, seem to illustrate to perfection the 2 great principles of naturalist fiction enunciated in Le Roman Expérimental, observation, as in the notes, and experimentation, as in the outline sketch, in which the story is invented. In the earliest phase of work on the book, probably, though critics are divided on this point, around Easter 1880, Zola made no fewer than 4 different sketches, which show him groping for a structure and a narrative thread, often in directions quite divergent from the final story. Fundamental from the first, even before he had decided on the setting, a small town in the provinces was as far as he had got at the stage, was to be the contrast between his new heroine and Nana. Now I have my heroine, who is Pauline Quenu, born in 1852, making her the same age as Nana. In 1869 she is around 18. If I take Pauline as my central figure, she can be the radical opposite of Nana, for in my distribution of temperaments, she is her converse. Thus, where Nana gave herself to all, Pauline will give herself to just one, perhaps not even one. Where Nana was unleashed on the world with no moral compass, no social or religious inhibitions, she will create duties for herself and have values, religion, respectability, etc. But above all, she will produce virtue, as Nana produced vice. Zola would later differentiate Pauline's type of goodness, bonté, from the straightforward, honest virtue of Denise Baudu in The Lady's Paradise, allowing her to show hereditary fits of temper and adding a heroic element to her struggle against jealousy and the temptation to infidelity. The first plan of Chapter 6 indicates Pauline, violent and jealous, struggling for happiness against her heredity and the environment around her. As he acknowledged in the same note, however, his main problem would be to build a narrative around Pauline. It took him a long time to construct the plot, with numerous false starts, but using elements which, in different permutations, would eventually gel into the novel we now read. Among other divergent scenarios, he toyed with the idea of Pauline living with a herbalist tortured by his terrible invalid wife, perhaps marrying the son of the household, who had studied law, with the essential drama created by an epidemic and maybe a manslaughter by crime passionnel to start things off. In a letter of the 6th of March 1889 to a Dutch critic and admirer of his work, Jacques van Santenkolff, Zola revealed that he had long been thinking of writing a prose poem on the subject of la douleur, meaning both physical pain and moral psychological anguish, an idea that had left its mark on Lazare's Symphony of Suffering in The Bright Side of Life. This was to be the novel's overarching theme, and the opening of the second sketch brought Zola closer to the final mix of characters and plot. Perhaps something much simpler would be better. Suffering can be represented by an invalid father horribly tormented by some chronic disease, and a young man afflicted by a moral sickness, an impossible love. Then set up in the middle, over and above them, a figure of health and heroic goodness, Pauline, a strong, delicate temperament, thinking of everything, soothing all physical and moral ills. The invalid father eventually becomes Pauline's gout-ridden uncle, Monsieur Chanteau, while the young man, originally to have been called Albert and to have married Pauline, afflicted by constant thoughts of death which ruin his life, paralyze his actions, and turn everything into desolation, becomes Lazare. The great epidemic is forgotten. The drama and intensity of the book will have to be built up from the small, everyday sufferings of the characters. In the third sketch, Albert changes into Gérard and takes on more of the complex, contradictory characteristics of the future Lazare. Cowardly and brave, hard-working and lazy, lying and truthful, sincere and play-acting. The modern contemporary ego. Gérard would marry Pauline, then be unfaithful to her, and Zola was unsure whether to end the novel with the failure of the marriage or the birth of their child. The main difficulty would be how to reconcile what he intended to be the novel's lofty philosophical perspective with the banal, everyday realities of provincial life. Overall, by way of philosophy, I don't want to paint the small miseries and treacheries of provincial existence. On the contrary, I aim to paint a broad current of life, suffering and goodness, and here lies the difficulty. Not with my usual poetic means, but through a continual analysis of day-to-day events. Throughout the later twists and turns of the plot development, in the fourth sketch, for instance, Gérard is a musician and acquires a mother who dies in Pauline's arms. Zola remained preoccupied with the need to harmonize his grand, universal themes of suffering and goodness with the smaller-scale actions of his characters. Despite a strong constitution that allowed him to sustain his punishing work rate, by 1880 Zola was becoming more and more afflicted with hypochondria and psychosomatic disorders, fearing that he would not live to complete the planned 20 volumes of the Rougon Macquart cycle. The theme of death was also taking on increasing prominence in his novels. In chapter 12 of Nana, for instance, Nana and Mutha are haunted by a fear of dying. His morbid anxieties were exacerbated by the unexpected loss in quick succession of two of his most admired friends and literary role models, Louis Edmond Duranty, born 1833, founder of the realist movement, on the 9th of April, and his great mentor Gustave Flaubert, born 1821, on the 8th of May. Then, on the 17th of October 1880, came the hammer blow of the death of his mother. Looking back on that time in a letter of the 15th of December 1883, to fellow author and friendly rival Edmond de Goncourt, Zola wrote that he stopped working on The Bright Side of Life because I wanted to put into the work a lot of myself and those dearest to me, and after the recent shock of losing my mother, I no longer had the courage to write it. The manner of her death was distressing, and it left Zola completely disorientated, as his son-in-law, Maurice Leblanc, relates in terms closely foreshadowing events in chapter 6 of the novel. Emile Zola's grief was a pitiable sight. His excessive nerves forced him to flee the sight of his dying mother, locked in her final struggle for life. He would wander around the countryside or stay shivering in some room in the house. His wife, Alexandrine, looked after the patient with admirable devotion, particularly as the dying woman had developed a terror of her daughter-in-law, making dreadful scenes and accusing her of trying to poison her each time she gave her medicine to take. When, in February 1883, Zola finally got back to work on the book, he started adding increasingly autobiographical elements to the plot, making Lazare more like himself, as he revealed in an article, published in English, with the title, In the Days of My Youth, in the December 1901 issue of the American Bookman Review. You will find some of my early foibles, some of my early restlessness, ascribed to Lazare Chanteau in La Joie de Vivre. In early 1882, Goncourt noted in his diary confidences from Zola about his necrophobia, and how he and Alexandrine would lie awake in bed at night, as Lazare would do, thinking about death. Lazare's obsessive-compulsive behaviors in Chapter 7 are also Zola's own, and had started to develop from around the age of 30, as he later confessed to Dr. Toulouse of the Sainte-Anne mental hospital in Paris, when interviewed for the introductory volume of the latter's medico-psychological case studies on the links between genius and neurosis. He reported suffering from arithmomania, an obsession with counting, street lamps, cabs, the stairs at home, the objects on his desk, drawers that he had to open a set number of times before going to bed. And he shared with Lazare the nighttime superstition of opening his eyes 7 times to prove to himself that he was not going to die. Little wonder, in these circumstances, that the nervous pressure on Zola should have led to a breakdown, or that he should have been unable to continue with the bright side of life until he had grieved for his mother. Indeed, Hemming suggests that he finally wrote the novel as a form of therapy. The book represented for its author an attempt to rid himself of his neuroses by projecting them into a story. The Sea. The second phase of work started with 3 further outline sketches before Zola began to write the definitive opening chapter on the 25th of April 1883. It is in the first of these sketches, which builds on the plot outline of the 4th of the old series, that he shifts the novel's setting from the countryside around Paris to the Normandy coast. Like many well-off Parisians, Zola and his wife made a number of visits to Normandy, the first to Saint-Aubin in 1875, when he was 35 and had already published 10 novels. Sea bathing had become fashionable, and many affluent Parisians travelled to the coast by train during the summer months to take the waters and flee the stifling heat of the capital. The famous Normandy resorts of Trouville, Fécamp, and Étretat were already becoming the playground of the aristocracy, but they were too expensive for middle-class holidaymakers, who had to be content with more modest places, such as Saint-Aubin or Aromanches-les-Bains, still largely unspoilt but with minimal facilities for visitors. Zola's initial impressions of the area were quite mixed. Shortly after his arrival in Saint-Aubin, where he had taken Alexandrine in the hope that sea bathing would improve her health, he wrote to Edmond de Goncourt, "The country round here is horrid, but the sea is fine, and there's a sweet-smelling breeze." A few days later, in a letter to his publisher, Charpentier, he restated his distaste for the coastline in what, for a novelist, is an extraordinary literary metaphor. "No, you can't imagine anything uglier. It's flatter than the pavement of a town in ruins, and deserted, grey, immense. A great bourgeois thing, stretching as far as the eye can see, mile after mile of prose." In contrast, however, he soon came to appreciate the grandeur and romantic potential of the seascape. "The view is superb. The sea, always the sea. It's blowing a gale, driving the waves up to within a few meters of our door. Nothing could be more grandiose, particularly at night. It's quite different from the Mediterranean, at once very ugly and very grand." He was particularly struck, as he wrote to Paul Alexis on the 13th of August, by the rapidity with which the weather and the sea's mood could change, effects which are well captured in the marine descriptions in The Bright Side of Life. "We have superb weather here. Storms, hot sunny days, Neapolitan nights, phosphorescent seas, suddenly switching from one to the other. I've never known such varied changes of scenery. When the weather is dull and grey, the sea is grandiose in its immensity. I'm beginning to understand this part of the world, which at first I saw as abominably ugly." He had, he said, begun jotting down the impressions of the sea, for a grand descriptive episode of 20 pages or so that I dream of slipping into one of my novels. The result, some 8 years later, would be not just an episode, but the full-scale novel we have before us, in which the ever-changing sea forms a continuous descriptive and symbolic backdrop to the narrative. In a reply of the 7th of July 1887 to an inquiry from Van Santenkolff about his compositional methods, Zola revealed the inspiration for the location of his novel. "Bonneville is none other than Vierville, between Port-en-Bessin and Grand-Camp. a modified Vierville. I generally create the little village that I need in this way, keeping the neighbouring towns as they are in reality. That gives me greater freedom with my characters. Zola spent the summer of 1881 at Grand Camp, in the Calvados, and visited Vierville on his way between Grand Camp and Port-en-Bessin. A note in the preparatory dossier situates Bonneville 10 kilometres from Arromanches and 12 kilometres from Port-en-Bessin, which, as Pierre Conny points out, is impossible because Arromanches is itself only 10 kilometres from Port-en-Bessin. The real Vierville, a bathing resort with a long, straight beach of golden sand, backed by a small road and holiday villas, is indeed accessed by a road perpendicular to the sea, descending a valley between the cliffs, but these are relatively low, and the beach has no shingle bank or rocky pools. Zola presumably relocated Bonneville nearer to Arromanches, a stretch of coast with higher, eroding clay cliffs with a constantly changing foreshore of collapsed and unstable rocks. To add drama to the precarious situation of the houses in the hamlet, as well as to make the descent into the village more dramatic. Conny suggests that Bonneville may also owe something to Bagnères-sur-Mer, which lies some 15 kilometres east of Arromanches, because timber beach defences of the kind designed by Lazare were successfully implemented there in the 1850s, and the area also has suitably large amounts of seaweed. As always with Zola, however, the novel's setting is not just a realistic decor, but a symbolic reflection of the characters' states of mind and their struggles, the milieu that, in conjunction with their heredity, determines and reflects their action. Little Pauline is closely identified with the sea before her arrival in the Chanteau's household. Since leaving Paris, she had been constantly obsessed by the idea of the sea. She was dreaming about it, asking her aunt endless questions in the train and wondering aloud every time she saw a small rise in the landscape whether the sea lay beyond those mountains. At last, on the beach at Arromanches, she had stood there speechless and wide-eyed, her heart swelling with a deep sigh. Then, from Arromanches to Bonneville, she had kept poking her head out of the cabriolet, despite the wind, to look at the sea which accompanied them along their way. And now here was the sea again. It would always be there, like something that belonged to her. Slowly, with a sweeping gaze, she seemed to be making it her own. The sea, now so clear and gentle in the bright July sunshine, forms a benevolent backdrop to her developing relationship with Lazare during their expeditions along the coast when they bathe and play innocently on the beach, an idyllic earthly paradise. But it is also the unpredictable and implacable enemy from which Lazare tries to wrest both industrial profit and safety from destruction for the Bonneville fishermen and their families. It was one of the September flood tides rushing in with shattering force. No alert had been issued, but the gale, which had been blowing from the north since the previous day, had swollen the sea so monstrously that mountains of water were rearing up on the horizon and sweeping in, before crashing onto the rocks. In the distance, the sea was black beneath the shadow of the clouds as they galloped across the livid sky. As Olivier Gott remarks in an article on Zola's Normandy, the novel takes its rhythm from these tides, the alternation of calm seas and destructive storms. As with the eponymous bar in L'Assommoir, or the mine in Germinal, the sea, in The Bright Side of Life, becomes virtually a character in its own right, interacting with people and mirroring
Sample complete. Ready to continue?